To go down to sea in ships was the dream of an entire generation of Canadian youth. Boys from 100 tiny maritime ports answered Canada's call to arms. They were fishermen and fishermen's sons. They were boys and men who did not hesitate. They answered the call. They were simple men with calloused hands and broad smiles. They were the men and boys of the sea. They went down to those ships that went to sea. And some never came home again.
My name is Don Bellamy, and I'm a World War II veteran serving in the Navy. And of course, our major theater for the entire 5.5 years was the North Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic, the first sinking by the enemy, was on the second day of the war. And the last one, as far as we were concerned, was in April of 1945, with VE Day the following month. And this was a continuous battle, and we came close to losing it because our enemy was formidable in their purpose and also well trained. And we were fighting an uphill battle until mid-1943, when our fortunes turned a little bit, and of course the Battle of the Atlantic started coming to our favor. But that didn't end the action, because the last ship that we lost, and I'm talking warship now, was the HMCS Esquimalt in April of 1945. A lot of people don't realize how close we came to going down in the Battle of the Atlantic, and what a devastating difference would have been made had we lost the Battle of the Atlantic. Many people don't realize the number of ships that we lost due to enemy action in the St. Lawrence. We had 10 ships that were torpedoed and sunk by enemy action as far up the St. Lawrence River as Rimouski. And when I say 10 ships, I'm talking naval ships. I'm not talking the merchantmen that were torpedoed and sunk in the same area, which outnumbered us, what I've just said, by 2 to 1. I joined the Navy on Trafalgar Day, which was October the 10th, 1943. I was still only 16. My first ship was a corvette, the K-156. It was a short forecastle, flower class corvette. And they had the reputation of being able to roll on wet grass. And believe me, that's where most of us got our initiation into what it was like on the Atlantic in heavy weather. And believe me, there was nobody in our Navy that didn't suffer terrible seasickness. You were never dry, because everything on a short forecastle corvette especially came over the front end and right down on top of the entrance to the seaman's mess, which was in the forecastle, the front end of the ship. Sometimes the weather was so rough that the cooks in the galley could not function at all, because the ship was standing on end. And as a result, if we were at action stations, our meals were beetles and kai. Now, kai was a thick chocolate and full of sugar, as were the beetles. They were like the size of my thumb, and it was a candy. You suck on the candy, drink the beetles. That was your meal. And you were stuck with it. You had no choice, because the galley was usually soaking wet, and everything that was on the ranges was thrown all over the place. Wolf packs were where you had coordinated attacks by submarines, and they raised havoc with us. And we were almost helpless to do anything about it, because we didn't have enough ships, and sometimes the sea was pretty heavy, and finding them, locating them, where the attacks were coming from was most difficult, because that comes down to the other thing we didn't have in our Navy, was the up-to-the-minute equipment that other navies had. ASDIC, it was called ASDIC in my time, but it's now called sonar. We didn't have radar as well as other naval ships from other countries had. So we were sort of the bad boys, cleaning up the mess and so on and so forth, and oftentimes criticized. Well, we didn't do enough, our job wasn't good enough. We didn't have enough training and everything else. I'll tell you, it would have been much different if the Canadian Navy had not been there. And it was not unusual to lose. If you had a convoy of 40 or 50 ships, you may lose as high as 20. And your ship was going down underneath you. Your lifespan in the water was about 5 minutes at the most, and you were finished. And the Atlantic wasn't much better, no matter where you were in the winter. The age of our officers that were in charge of the ships, by today's standard, were probably quite amazing. The skipper of most of the corvettes, not all of them, but most of them, were in their mid-20s. These were the fellows that were in charge of the ship and everything it did. We didn't know anything other than what we were trained to do. We had to put all of our confidence in the skipper and the officers on the bridge. And believe me, some of those officers did a tremendous job under 90 days training, and that's where we got the 90-day wonders from. They were usually university types who took courses in navigation and so on and so forth, and they did a commendable job. As a matter of fact, my skipper on my last ship was 25 years old, and he was in charge of a destroyer, and he did a great job. I probably was just as afraid or scared, frightened, whatever you want to use as a word, as we were, but he never showed it. All right, survivors. The merchantmen had a fairly reasonable number of survivors. There was one case in our Navy that was a tragedy indeed. The St. Croix, HMCS St. Croix, was torpedoed and sunk, and there were survivors. They were picked up by a Royal Navy corvette who was in charge of picking up survivors, because that was a specific task. Otherwise, you didn't stop, you had to keep going. They picked up the survivors off the St. Croix, and it was the HMS Incheon, and it itself was torpedoed the next day, and there was only one survivor. The entire ship's company of the St. Croix survived to get back to Canada. All the rest were lost when the Incheon went down after it was torpedoed. Now, it was an instance like that that was hard on all of us. Human nature being what it is, time takes a toll, and it also has a tendency to have us forget what happened when we were fighting an enemy from without. And that's understandable. It's been a long time since World War II. We used to know our enemy. We had uniforms, and we had sort of camaraderie of some type, fragile though it was. And now we wonder, what the heck did we really accomplish in all of what we suffered in World War II? But I think that it's important that we remember what the men and women did a great job, by the way. We never forget who were there. We sometimes listen to some so-called historical presentations, and they're not always accurate because the years are taking their toll. But those who were there, we will never forget. We will never forget. And we will never forget those who didn't come back.